Hi, joining the radio. Everyone's joining the party. Okay, good evening, boys and girls. We are starting on time, which is generally what we do. Okay, cool. So welcome to the party. And from the bush, the hyenas are going absolutely bonkers tonight. So kind of cool. There's obviously a huge fight going on. You'll probably hear them in a few minutes, even through the microphone on my computer. They're right outside the camp. There was a huge domestic argument about 2 minutes ago, and they're whooping all around the camp at the moment. So it's quite exciting. All right, cool. So we're taking off from where we started off last week with Artiodactylans or set Artiodactylans. This week we're going on to Ruminants. It's a two-part series. The next class will be on Friday, definitely. So we'll be doing Wednesday night and Friday night. So 2 classes this week. Woo. And then, of course, Q&A every Saturday. All right. So as always, the book of the week is Wildcats of the World. We've gone past Predators, but this is a really good book. I bought it in PDF about 2 years back. And I don't know where to get a hard copy, but you can buy from DK Publishers, and you can actually just read the digital version. It's just really good reading material, going into in-depth studies on all the cat's behavior. All right, okay, so going back to even-toe ungulates. Simply put, even-toe ungulates are animals with cloven hooves. So the horse on the right is not an even-toe ungulate. He is not one of the guys we're talking about. They're odd-toe ungulates, and we'll be doing them in a few weeks. All right, so we're focusing on ruminants this week. What is a ruminant? Ruminants are animals with 4-chambered stomachs, okay? And they don't have 4 stomachs. I know people hear that rumor that they get 4 separate stomachs. They don't. It's a 4-chambered stomach. The teeth grow continuously throughout their lives. Another fun fact. They do not have upper incisors. They do have bottom incisors, though. And they have a thick dental pad to assist with the cropping and chewing of food. And they're able to rapidly feed and digest their food at a later period of time when they find somewhere more comfortable to sit down. So you can look at a cow skull over here. Whoever's microphone is that is, please turn it off. And you can see over here, he doesn't have any top incisors, only the bottom incisors. And this is where you would have that thick dental pad over here to help him crop. His molars also continuously grow throughout his life. He also has a really, really developed jaw for chewing and cropping and crushing food and vegetation. And unlike predators, they can actually move the jaws from side to side. Predators can only move the jaws up and down. Herbivores, particularly the ruminants, can move the jaws from side to side. Okay, and you can also see that they have quite small brains because they're not very intelligent creatures. It does vary from animal to animal, but generally prey items don't have remotely the same amount of cranial capacity as a predator, because being a prey item, you don't really need to be very smart to solve your food issues. Predators have to plan, improvise, think, strategize, and it requires a lot more intellectual ability. So you'll find the brains of predators inherently just tend to be bigger than the brains of prey. Not always the case, but almost, it's generally the case. Okay, so rumination. So what is rumination? It's effectively the process by which cows and all their relatives digest their food. And this involves chewing the cud, and involves the 4-chambered stomach, and all the other aspects. So one of the benefits of this is that they're able to bulk feed and worry about digestion in a later period of time. So they spend less time eating and can focus on threats, and they're able to eat less food and extract more nutrients from it. I'm sure any of you guys that have worked on a farm or have been out in the bush, or even on TV, you've seen animals chewing the cud, and this is effectively what it is. So to go into a 4-chambered stomach, you've got 4 aspects to it: the rumen, the reticulum, the amassum, and the obomassum. Now, the rumen is the primary site of microfermentation. So the animal will take its vegetation, chew it up, swallow it, and will go into the rumen, where microbes break down the cellulose material. From there on, it will go into the reticulum, and this is for particle separation. So the big particles and the small particles get separated. The small particles get passed on, the large particles get regurgitated, and they chew the cud. So you'll see that cow or that antelope sitting for hours, grinding his teeth for hours, chewing the cud. So he regurgitates it from the reticulum, from that secondary stomach area, back up the esophagus, and continues to chew it until it's fine particles. He'll swallow it again, it'll go through the rumen, and back into the reticulum. If there's anything large, it gets regurgitated again, and this can continue indefinitely. And what this does is it creates this really fine powdery material that just makes it incredibly easy to digest. There's every bit of surface area is exposed, and all the microbes can break it down, and all the stomach acids can break it down as well. After that, it passes to the margin, and this is where fatty acids are absorbed. Okay, so this is where we're getting to the first stage of digestion before it even gets to the intestinal tract. The actual fatty acids are absorbed in the margin, and finally, actual chemical digestion takes place in the stomach acid in the ovomargin over here, the true stomach, which is also the source of rennet. What is rennet, you might ask? So rennet is actually the enzyme that we get from cow stomachs or from ruminant stomachs that we use to make cheese. So what it does is you apply it to your milk, and it separates the curds, solids, and the whey, which become liquids, and they dehydrate the whey later, and that's where you get whey powder coming from. But the curds we use to make cheese and yogurt and all the sorts of other, well, not necessarily yogurt, but particularly cheese. And rennet is an animal product in the sense that it actually comes from the body of an animal. So cheese cannot be vegetarian. I hate to tell you this. So if you're a vegetarian and you're eating cheese, I think there are 1 or 2 cheeses that use vegetarian rennet, but the vast majority of cheeses use animal-based rennet. So it's not vegetarian. You're using an animal stomach if you're eating cheese. You need to specifically check if you've actually consuming vegetable rennet products. Okay, so even-toed ungulate families. We've got 6 major families: the Tragulidae, the Giraffidae, the Antilocapridae, the Musciidae, and the Cervidae, and of course, if you're from Africa, the Bovidae, which are prevalent here. So the Tragulidae are the Chevrotains, and now these guys are kind of cool. A lot of people don't know about these animals. They had a really good innings for about 20 million years, and they've kind of been displaced by deer and antelope everywhere else in the world. And they're commonly known as mouse deer or Chevrotains. They do not have antlers and horns, and most species spend long hours in water. And there's a lot of evidence to show that they actually have some root ancestry with hippos as well, going back quite a few million years. So there's arguments to say that they actually may have some sort of evolutionary relation. Well, not may, there is evolutionary relationships connecting them to hippos and cetaceans down the line. Ancient Chevrotains are the true Chevrotains, the true mouse deers, are considered to be ancestors of both bovids and deer. Bovids, remember, are any animals with true horns. Okay, not deers because they have antlers. We'll get onto that today. And most are herbivores, but the water Chevrotain, which is pretty interesting, limited to Central Africa, regularly eats fish and invertebrates, crabs, shellfish, whatever he can get his hands on. So there's actually some carnivorous behavior there, even though he has a 4-chambered stomach. Quite interesting. So the Tragulidae, there's 10 species throughout the world, 3 genera. The water Chevrotain, which is in Central Africa, the Sri Lankan spotted Chevrotain, or mouse deer, as they also call them throughout the world. So maybe you heard the word mouse deer, same thing. And the Philippine mouse deer, which is limited to the Philippines. There's 7 other species, mostly limited throughout Asia. Now, these guys are not duikers. They're not related to them. Those are antelopes. So even though they look very similar, we have some evolutionary convergence. And these are very, very primitive. So another cool thing about them is because they're the most primitive of the even-toed ungulates, they actually share a lot of similarities with pigs. And pigs and Chevrotains have an ancestor dating back about 30-40 million years ago. And both these species, well, both these groups of animals have primitive ungulate feet. They both lack facial glands. They both have sharp crowns on the premolars, something more that actually stems from almost a predatorial background. And their sexual behavior is extremely similar. The way they mate, their chemical signatures, the mating practices between males and females, the way they keep their dens, very similar between the two. So over here, you can see those very primitive cloven hooves. Oh, we've got a person asking questions. No, dik-dik is quite different. That's an antelope. We'll be coming to dik-diks later. So dik-diks are not Chevrotains. They look similar. There's a bit of evolutionary convergence. And dik-diks are descendants of the very first Chevrotains, give or take 30 million years. But yeah, they look similar, but dik-diks have horns. Very primitive little horns, but yeah. Okay, so going back to the pigs, you can see these very primitive cloven hooves, where the dew claws are almost touching the ground, and it's almost like a digitated foot structure like a predator. I mean, it's very, very primitive. They only have the most rudimentary of cloven hooves. Likewise, you can see with the Chevrotain, the mouse deer's hooves as well, almost like a digitigrade foot structure, or even a palmate foot structure. Those dew claws at the back of, still quite apparent, and almost looks like a hand or a typical footprint. Okay. On top of this, which is quite interesting, is those highly modified frontal incisors, which you find with your pig-like ancestors as well. With these guys, the incisors point down, sorry, the canines point down, whereas with pigs, old world pigs, they tend to point up. All right, so you can see that over here. So what you're going to find going forward is that a lot of the deer species, the true deers, have canines as well, and whereas antelope don't. And we'll come to that in the next lecture on Friday, but canines are very apparent, and then they actually evolved before the horns and antlers, so they were both for competing with other males and also for self-defense. So this is a skeleton over here, and you can see if you go look at a Dik skeleton or a Dacre skeleton, that same sort of hunchback spine, and this is just indicative of the lifestyle of an animal. You have a small tail. Oops, we got another question. Are the canines and males? No. Males and females have canines. Males have longer canines though. So you'll see them just very apparent. And then they're much smaller than females though, because the females aren't doing the fighting. And what you're coming back to the tail, you'll see that with the tails on a lot of prey items, the tails are shorter. These animals don't want to have tails. They don't want to have anything sticking off the back that's going to be able to give them an ability for predators to drag them down. So the shorter the tail, the better. And in many of the species, the tails are almost just, rudimentary. They're almost non-existent. You find that hunch spine antelopes and hunch spine deer and Chevrotains tend to live in forest environments. They're not relying on long tracts of burst speed or long tracts of intense speed. They're relying on bouncing and bounding and zipping between bushes, and you want a spring-like function body for that. You also want a smaller rib cage, because you're not looking for long distance running where you need lots of oxygen. You're looking for compact, neat little build with long legs and a spring-like function. So they're built like a slinky, effectively. Small skulls, well, because they're nibbling, and they're more browsers than grazers. Okay, so how do we know these animals are related? Isn't there just some strange coincidence that these things are related and we're just sucking our thumbs? And a lot of guys say, well, you can't just lump animals together. And there's a rigorous system for investigating relationships between animals. And that's the reason why we know that a Chevrotain can't be linked with a Dacre or with a Dik. They're not related in the conventional sense. They're not any more related than humans and rodents, even though they look similar. So we look for connections between these animals. So we compare three aspects. The fossil evidence, very important, probably the oldest way of doing it, because you look at the actual physical evidence in the fossils. We look at the phenotypic similarities, as sciences and medical sciences and biological sciences have proved. We look at the physical similarities, and we are able to notice relationships between animals. Certain animals have key indentations in their teeth, other animals don't have key indentations in their teeth, and so on and so forth. Bones are morphed in a certain way with some species, and bones are morphed in a certain way with other species. So we can find looser or further relationships. And most readily, which has really just been the final nail in the coffin, or the final concrete answers, genetic similarities. We haven't been able to do this since the 70s and 80s, but this is just true, apparent understanding. And with all three things connecting together, we start to find really comprehensive studies of animals. And the odds of these things being lucky coincidences would be incalculably small. It'd be like, standing out in the middle of the Saudi desert and someone handing you $1 billion and then 5 minutes later a meteorite hitting you. It's just not going to happen. Okay, so we look at the fossil evidence. This is Leptomeryx over here, considered to be the ancestor of deer and antelope. You find similarities with both species that these two don't share. So he shares similarities with both of them, but these two don't share similarities with each other. Okay, so there's obviously a connection somewhere there between all three. The genetic evidence, we talked about molecular clocks, and when we do a workshop on evolution, we'll get in depth into what a molecular clock actually is. It's a little bit sciencey, so we won't go too in depth. And you can see with every generation or with every connection, the genetic similarities are more and more comparable. And then finally, phenotypic similarities. So with every grouping, there's a closer and closer and closer level of relationship. And again, we won't get too much into that on this lecture. We'll save that for that actual particular lecture. Okay, so going on from the Chevrotains, everyone's favorite, the giraffes. Now, there are either 2 or 5 species of the giraffids. I subscribe to the view that there's 1 species of giraffe because they're all able to interbreed as far as I am aware of. Some people say because geographically they're separated, there's actually 4 species of giraffe. So it's really up for a matter of scientific conjecture and opinion. I'm not a geneticist. I just have an opinion and I'm looking for someone to prove me wrong. Okay, so there's either 2 or 5, depending. Either 1 species of giraffe or 4 species of giraffe, just depending on which zoologist or biologist you ask. There's the giraffe and the Okapi. I'm sure you guys have seen the Okapi in a zoo, probably not in a while because they're limited to the Congo Basin. Now, the Okapi was known for centuries by the locals, but it was only officially documented and described in 1901. So he's only been known by the Western world for 119 years, which is just the other day. And I know a lot of people say, oh, they look like zebras, but they are in no way related to a zebra. A zebra is a horse. It's an odd-toed ungulate. And these are even-toed ungulates. They are related to giraffes. And they even have the same sort of ossicones on their skulls and a very similar structure, that elongated neck and all their biology. So these are the giraffids. This is a giraffe skull again. You'll see that he has no upper incisors. He's got those canines, molars and premolars that continue to grow throughout his life. That really elongated, strong jaw. And not much else going on. And you'll find with the males, he has a far more calloused, rounded forehead than a female. So this looks like a female skull. Also the ossicones over there. And these are not called horns, they're called ossicones. So they do not have horns. Rather, they are ossified cartilage, which means this cartilage, the same stuff your nose is made out of, that has become bone-like. It's been inundated with calcium carbonate and becomes bone-like. It's not fully attached to the skull, as you can see there. It actually looks like it's fused. So it's a piece of cartilage that is actually fuses to the skull with age. And there's just this cartilage and they're sheathed in skin. So there's not keratin like fingernails or hair, it's actually skin. And when they're born, they're not actually attached to the skull booth. They're like these 2 little round discs and they're sitting loose on the skull. And only as the giraffe gets older, it actually fuses to the skull. So kind of cool. Giraffes, I'm sure we all know the story about giraffes having long necks, 7 vertebrae. I'm not going to get into those details. It's the same for all mammals. But what I find really interesting is that giraffes have a hard time drinking water. Their blood pressure is about twice that of a human being. I think they were saying that it can, at its prime, it beats up to 127 kilometers an hour, 137 kilometers an hour rushing through the body. It's a lot. I don't remember the exact number. But in order to stop the brain basically being ruptured when they drink water, they have a series of valves which control blood pumping down into the brain. And then they have this network, this delta-like system in the brain to even like to spread out the flow of blood and really just help it ease into the brain without causing any sort of rupturing or aneurysms. And then when they lift up the head again, the valves open up and blood is able to pump as much as usual. So they have a really complicated series of arteries and veins controlling blood throughout the body. Okay, now the scientific disagreements occur, as I said, about the number of giraffes. Some people say that there's numerous subspecies or that there's 4 species with numerous subspecies. And the differences lie in how individual scientists define a species. And the term species is it's a human concept. There's no such thing as a species in nature. There are individuals that are able to mate and there are individuals that are unable to mate. And what defines a species is really a man-made concept. It's very apparent when you compare like a buffalo and a wolf, but whether an Indian buffalo and a Chinese buffalo are different species is kind of obscure because they might be able to mate. Remember, we're still not really sure. A lot of scientists disagree whether Neanderthals are a separate species of human or if they were separate subspecies of human. So, you know, it really depends on the variation. But coming back to where we were, species come from a very simple thing called reproductive isolation barriers. If things are stopping them breeding, they become a different species. So there's 9 different variations of giraffe in the world, okay, all found throughout Africa. Nowhere in the world do they have giraffes. And there's 9 different variations. They're very easy to identify. They're all quite distinct. But again, there's enough genetic difference between some of these guys. There's a lot of scientists, as I say, to number them as 4 different species, and then there's these variations within. Okay, so now reproductive isolation barriers are simple. There's geographical, spatial, being at like higher or lower altitude, temporal, being time, seasonal differences, behavioral differences, morphological differences, and molecular signatures. Molecular signatures, very simple, your pheromones, what you smell like, and whether people find you attractive. So geographical differences. So you'd have an ancestral population, something like a mountain range or a river will form between the 2 populations, and because they are not able to interbreed with each other, they evolve on different tracts. One species forms one way, another species forms another way, based on their environment and based on mutations. Eventually, over a long enough period of time, you get 2 separate species. And even though they might migrate into each other's areas, because they've evolved over such a long period of time that genetically they're too different, they are no longer able to interbreed. Much like kudus and inyala, they are related. Spatial differences, even within the same environment, you might find individuals not breeding. So you'd have an original population. Maybe 1% of the population spends most of their time on top of mountains, whereas the other spends their time a lot on the plains. Because they're permanently isolated from each other through personal choice, eventually you get speciation forming, much like the mountain reedbuck and the reedbuck. Okay, so that's a very easy example to understand. They're both reedbucks, and because one had a preference very long ago for staying in high altitudes, they gradually evolved in a different direction. Temporal differences, simple. Some species will like to operate during the middle of the night. Some species will like to operate early in the afternoon or late in the afternoon, or some individuals within the same species. I myself, I'm a bit of a night owl. The chances of me meeting a girl who's a bit of a night owl are probably much higher than me meeting a girl who likes to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning. So again, and over time, our children will continue to be night owls and so on and so forth. There's people that like to get up early in the morning, they're not going to interact with me as much, and effectively what will happen is that we'll become different species. Unlikely with humans, but no, that's the case it goes. Frogs are a very good example. Bats are a very good example. Bird species are also very good examples of that. Seasonal differences, certain species will certain individuals of species will behave differently. Some individuals will flower in May, like this is an example over here, Vizinia. Others will flower in June. So simply because they're flowering at different times of the year, eventually they will separate as species as well. And behavioral differences, personal preferences. Some individuals prefer to live in one environment, another group of individuals prefer to live in another environment. Or they'll like to do certain things that are different. Some species like to drink water at night and some species like to drink water a day. Eventually those differences catch up and they will separate. And morphological. Okay, the Great Dane and the Chihuahua are both species of dog. Genetically, they're identical at the moment. They're both descendant of the European grey wolf. But all things being equal, if we gave them 80,000 more years and they were never able to interbreed with each other, and there was no crossing or blending between middle ground species like Labradors and Rottweilers and all those species that could create these links between the two, eventually they would become 2 separate species. Their genetics would mutate to such a level that they wouldn't be able to interbreed anymore. So morphological differences between the 2 individuals of the same species would keep them separated. Okay. So, and of course, molecular signature, personal preference of smell and taste. Like some girls love the way certain guys smell. Some females will like the way certain pheromones of certain males and not the pheromones of other males. And that will in turn affect their selection, and that will in turn affect their genetics down the line. So those are all the reasons why animals separate and how they evolve into different forms. And this is also why it's difficult to define a species, because there's a lot of gray area. Genetics is pretty much the only real area that you can work with, but even then it's a bit of a gray area. Okay, so going on to the pronghorns, the Antilocapridae. And this is limited to North America. Fun fact, they're actually distant cousins of giraffes. In fact, some scientists still lump them under the giraffids rather than having their own family. There's only one living species, the pronghorn, and they have true horns, but kind of weird. They actually shed them like antlers. Bit strange, actually. Now, the musk deer are limited to Southeast Asia. They're also known as vampire deer because they have these gigantic tusks, or fangs, if you want to call them that. And they they lack antlers and they have these long canines, hence the term vampire deer, which is a great term, like this. And they have these potent musk glands, which is one of the reasons why they're so aggressively poached and hunted out. For a long period of time, both Europe and the East would use these musk glands, which are these big cyst-like glands all over the body, and they've got this very musky smell. And a lot of people would like to use them for perfumes. And they have a single pair of mammary glands, a little fun fact, nothing special, but it's usually due to the fact that they are only calving once a year and they invest a lot of energy in protecting their calf. And they're more closely related to bovides than deer. Even though the common term is musk deer, they are more closely related to animals with horns. So these are these guys over here. There's 7 species, 1 genus, again limited to cold areas in Asia. And all look kind of like vampires, actually. Very cool looking. So glands are something that Chevrotains don't have, but both deer and bovids do have. And individuals have different types of glands, and we'll go more into glands specifically with the antelope. It's an area that I'm more familiar with than with deer glands. But they all have various effects on the bodies in terms of their breeding, scent marking, territory, that sort of thing. All right, so getting on to the cervids, the deers. So going back to where we were earlier, Leptomeryx was a Chevrotain dating back about 34 million years ago. He's considered to be the ancestor of deer and bovids. He shares physiological similarities with both groups of animals. So this is what an artist's interpretation of what would have looked like. Obviously, we don't know the colors, but we can assume by looking at the modern mouse deer. Okay, so deer are the second most diverse family of artiodactylans after the bovids. The bovids have the most. Deers grow antlers instead of horns, and these are shed annually. Horns are permanent. Antler growth cycles are linked to the seasonal day length, and which in turn promotes testosterone production. So the longer the period of time during the day, the more testosterone the animal develops, and then of course antlers grow as well. And Africa has no native cervids. We don't have any deers native to Africa. We've got tons of antelope, no deers. Okay. So very simple. Around summer, the horns, late winter going into spring, the horns will start to grow. They go into what they call velvet, which is where skin is still covering the actual antlers. As they develop larger and larger and larger, eventually they form the hard antlers, and the actual velvet starts to shed off, like just peels like skin. And you've got this hard, bony calcium antlers, which stick around until late winter. Eventually, during the shortest days of the year, they shed them off because they don't need them. And then again, coming into spring, the cycle continues. And this goes, and every year they live, the antlers get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger with every passing season. So this is all it is really. It's velvet on the outside. It's cartilage that eventually ossifies and becomes like a bone-like structure, and it becomes incredibly hard. I know a lot of people seem to think that antlers are quite soft, but they're actually just as hard as any horn. So there's 3 different types of antlers. Palmate, which is usually reserved for the really big deer, like elk or moose. Branching, the more conventional type, and you get spike-like antlers as well. A lot of people would think these are horns, but they shed them. And they also go through velvet as well. That's the easiest way to tell the difference between a horn and an antler. Horns don't get that velvet. They've got a keratinous, like nail-like structure covering them, whereas the antlers, again, they have that velvet, which is skin, and that shed, and eventually you just got that pure white, bony calcium underneath. So there's lots of benefits to antlers over horns, actually. The hindrance of having them is limited to summer. They don't have them in winter, so that's actually great. So they don't have to carry around these big, heavy, knocking obstacles on their heads in winter, which means they don't have to put as much energy into carrying them around, which means they need less food. They can also be regrown if they're broken. So if they lose their antler in one season in a fight, next season they'll grow another one. Unlike horns, once it's gone, it's gone. It's not coming back. It gives you a much wider range of defense than horns. You've got this big wraparound effect as opposed to just 2 spikes. And because they're so prominent and noticeable compared to horns, they're also incredibly important in sexual selection of females. Females can easily see an older bull from a younger bull, and they can also see a far more effective male than a weaker male because of these giant antlers that he has. So antlers are actually pretty cool. They get a bad rap compared to antelope, but deer are fantastic, and we should appreciate them far more than we do. So you get 2 groups of deer, Old World and New World. I don't have to explain what those are again. So they all share similar ankle structures based on the two groups of animals, and they're otherwise known as plesiometacarpal deer. And they're divided into two tribes. A tribe is a loose organization of animals slightly below a family, slightly above a genus, where we're not exactly sure of the relationship. You get primitive deer and true deer. We're going to go through this quite quickly. So primitive deer have primitive antlers and fangs. They're limited to East Asia. There are two species, tufted deer and the barking deer. They're very, tufted deer look quite cool. Actually, we've got these little nodules over here, which these become little short antlers and they shed them manually. They got those wonderful vampire teeth as well. The true deer are widespread throughout Eurasia, but have been introduced to Africa, Americas, New Zealand, and so forth. There are 8 genera, 20 species. There's a lot of species. The spotted deer over here from Sri Lanka, the Samba deer, and the Caspian red deer, all well known. And what you'll notice with deer is that a lot of the larger deer have these straight spines, which is, and again, similar to our antelope. Generally, the spine indicates the lifestyle. Plains animals tend to have straighter spines. Forest animals tend to have curved spines because of the habitats. Then, you want to obviously be a faster runner when you're living in plains. New World deer are limited mostly to the Americas, but a couple of the larger ones like elk and moose, same thing really, are found throughout the world, as well as reindeer. And they include the largest and the smallest deer species. And they're divided into 3 tribes: the Acelerini, the Capillarini, and the Rangerifini. The Acelerini is only one species. The largest of all deer, the moose, which weighs up to 800 kilograms, is one species. And there's about 9 different varieties. They're known as elk in some part of the world and moose in other parts of the world. And their antlers vary as well. So the Irish elk was probably, it's famous to Ireland. They still use the coat of arms all over Ireland today. And they went extinct around 7,700 years ago. Now, the Irish elk, as you can see, was absolutely gigantic. They found them in peat bogs all the time in Ireland, readily formed skeletons, and they just, obviously being exactly the same as a modern moose, they covered in moose fur and would look exactly the same, but they were slightly bigger. So you look at these giant antlers and you can say, what possible function could they have? And this is a case of runaway evolution. And with every generation, females select individuals with bigger and bigger and bigger antlers. The guys with the biggest antlers always get selected, but there gets a cutoff point. So you look at the physical, the fitness benefit, okay, so the attractiveness to potential mates. So the antler size, as the antlers get bigger, he becomes more and more attractive to females. However, the cost of that fitness, the compromising of survival, having these huge antlers requires a lot of energy, also makes them slower. So eventually you get a point where individuals are not able to have a bigger antlers than that. Even though the girls will find more and more impressive, it actually is jeopardizing a survival. And what will happen is eventually a species will become extinct if the fitness cost outranks the fitness benefit of the animal. And this is called runaway selection. And we don't think that these animals were hunted to extinction. We just think they went extinct of their own accord because the antlers became unsustainable for a species. And it happens a lot of times with a lot of animals. It happens with many elephant species as well. The Capillarini, which are the roe deer, they're only found in Eurasia. Both species are highly vocal. They use a range of barks, mews, shouts, squeals, almost pig-like in that respect. They're medium-sized deer, and they're the only ungulates to go through embryonic diapause. If you remember from our talk about bears, that's when they're actually be able to pause the embryo. They're pregnant, they're able to put a pause button on it and say, later, but when I can actually afford to have this baby. So they're the only ones. I know impalas have got this reputation, but that's still up for debate. But they've been conclusively proven to have embryonic diapause. A lot of cool respect there. There's only one genus. There's 2 species, the European roe deer and the Siberian roe deer. Quite different in color, and also throughout the year they change in color as well. The Rangerifini, which are reindeer and relatives, and with the exception of the reindeer, they're limited to the Americas. There's 7 genera, and depending again on how you define a species, there's either 16 or 25 species. The reindeer is known as a reindeer throughout Asia and Europe. It's known as a caribou in the United States. A lot of people don't know that. I didn't know that until fairly recently as well. I thought they were different. So reindeers are the only truly domesticated deer species, as in when they're actually commercially farmed. The others are hunted, but not truly domesticated. And numerous Eurasian tribes use them for draft animals, for meat, and for milk. And they're also one of the few deer species where the females also grow antlers. And due to the fact they live on the steppes of Siberia, Russia, and Canada, lichen are actually a major part of their diet. So if you don't know what lichen is, we'll get around to that another day. And it's a combination of fungus and bacteria. And because in winter it's hard to find grasses and shrubs, they actually eat lichen in the winter in large quantities. It's kind of cool. So you can see the various Eurasian and Asian tribes farming and living off deer. The range of Giraffidae also include other species like the taruca, which is found throughout the Andes, otherwise known as the Andean deer, the pygmy bronchit, which is very similar to our duikers in terms of appearance, but it has antlers instead of horns, and the marsh deer, who's a swamp specialist, much like our reedbuck and our waterbuck. Doesn't have those glands, though, which we'll discuss in another lesson. So, one of the big differences between old world deer, and this is purely academic, is that old world deer have proximal remnants of the lateral metacarpal bone, which means they've got that little remnant bone at the top of their leg, whereas new world deer have a distal remnant between the lateral metacarpal bone. So again, with scientists, when they're trying to figure out exactly where these animals come from, then the relationships, these are the sorts of keys that they start to look at. They don't just look at what the animal looks like, they look at the physiology, connections in the bones, the fossils, the DNA, and they start to build up all these connections together. And it's not really important to you, but I still find it interesting. Now, deer are actually important for ecosystems, a lot more important than people realize. And they're predominantly browsers, some are mixed feeders, and they're important growth stimulators for a lot of forest species. With a lot of forest species, if they're not browsed on, they tend to grow up rather than out. But if you prune your bushes, they tend to grow outwards and become denser and more foliate. So they're actually important for stimulating growth in forest species and understory species. Many are important nutrient renewers for permafrost and high altitude areas. They go through areas en masse, they migrate and they defecate all over the place and urinate all over the place and introduce nutrients back into those environments. And also a lot of these baked and frozen soils are really hard like concrete, and when you have these huge migrations of reindeer and elk, they help to break up the soils and actually allow seeds to grow in the next generation. So they're important for the ecology of many frozen areas. There's also a significant overlap in ecological roles by deer and antelope. Wherever you get deer, you tend not to have antelope, and wherever you tend to have antelope, you don't have deer. They have similar ecological roles, and there's no space for one or the other grouping. And there's numerous accounts of evolutionary convergence where you have duikers, you'll have Chevrotains or mouse deer also overlapping and looking very similar. And deer tend to be more generalist in their lifestyle rather than specialist. Most of the antelope are fairly specialist in their lifestyle, whereas deers tend to be quite generalist because they go through harsher winters and summers, so they have to be able to survive winter conditions and summer conditions, whereas African antelope and even Asian antelope tend to have subtropical to tropical weather all around. So those are the deer species. On Friday, we'll be going through the antelope and we'll be answering questions about diseases and various other things. I hope you enjoyed the lecture. On that note, I'm going to say goodbye. Auf Wiedersehen. Adios. Arrivederci. Hope it was entertaining. If you have any questions, you're welcome to message me on WhatsApp or Facebook, and hope you enjoyed it. Cool. Adios.
Thank you very much.
All right. Cheerio. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.